If you joined us last week, then you got an overview of the Michigan judicial system, which is on the ballot this year, from Tom Sinas of Sinas Dramas Law Firm. In that, we thought we'd take a deeper dive into the Michigan Supreme Court. Tom from Sinas Dramas Law Firm, thanks for joining us this morning.
Thanks for having me back, Todd.
Absolutely. So let's talk about the Supreme Court here in Michigan. How does it differ, say, from appellate courts here in the state or even nationally?
Great question. It is different from both our other appellate courts in the state of Michigan and the federal system. So let's start with the other appellate courts. As we talked about last week, the first place that people go when they want to appeal something from a trial court is the Michigan Court of Appeals. And oftentimes that's the last word. But our highest court in our state is the Michigan Supreme Court. And that is a court that has the discretion to decide whether or not it wants to take up a particular matter that has been reviewed by the Court of Appeals first. And so it differs from our Court of Appeals because, of course, it's the highest court in the land, but also because it only hears a select number of appeals in a given year. It differs from the federal system because federal judges, whether they are trial court judges or United States Supreme Court justices, those judges and justices are appointed for life, meaning they don't stand for re-election. Now, the Michigan Supreme Court, as we talked about last week, all judges in Michigan at some point end up being accountable to the voters, and that is true for the Michigan Supreme Court. So it's a little bit like the U.S. Supreme Court because it only hears a select number of cases and because its decisions are so important, but it's different because on the U.S. Supreme Court, of course, those justices are appointed for life, and that's not true on the Michigan Supreme Court.
Okay, so the Michigan Supreme Court is not a lifetime appointment. Yeah, eventually there will be a name on a ballot. Now, when it comes to things being politicized, which it seems like we hear a lot about these days, what's the actual role of a political party when it comes to, say, Michigan Supreme Court elections?
It is really unique. So when you open your ballot this year, you're going to see that there are choices you can make regarding the Michigan Supreme Court. You will not see next to any of those candidates a party designation like you would, say, in the governor's race or a state or a House of Representatives race or state Senate race. However, the political parties can endorse candidates for the Michigan Supreme Court, and they do, and they have this year. So the Republican Party has endorsed a couple of candidates. The Democratic Party has endorsed a couple of candidates. So the political parties play a role in the sense that they're transparent about the parties that they endorse. But when you open your ballot, you will not see a designation. And what that also means, and this is really important, if you are a straight ticket voter, meaning you vote one party or another, that straight ticket voting will not result in a vote for the Michigan Supreme Court because the candidates are not affiliated with a political party designation on the ballot. So it's a little bit different than other judicial races and also different than your traditional election.
Okay, so we can't vote straight party ticket and include that. That's something separate. And you're not going to see the designation, Democrat or Republican or independent, next to any of these names. So it really pays to do your homework. When it comes to electing these judges and others, members of the judicial system, we hear about people being appointed all the time. Like, can the governor just put people in there?
Well, as we talked about last week, if there's a vacancy in a particular seat, and this is true in the Michigan Supreme Court, during a justice's term, then the governor can appoint that vacancy. So, for example, and this is very pertinent, we have heard that the Chief Justice of the Michigan Supreme Court, Bridget Mary McCormick, is going to be moving on and retiring from her role as Chief Justice of the Michigan Supreme Court. That will likely create a situation where the governor can appoint a person to fill that vacancy. Now, ultimately, that vacancy, whoever fills that vacancy will have to stand for election at some point, but the governor can fill vacancies under those circumstances. But as I said before, ultimately, everyone on the Michigan Supreme Court does appear on the ballot.
This is going to be a pretty big ballot for a midterm. I mean, what does this year's ballot look like, and how do people prepare for this?
Okay, great question. How do they prepare? Do your homework ahead of time. This is really important, obviously. The Michigan Supreme Court being the the last voice in the law of the land has a huge impact on people's lives. So you got to do your homework about what candidates you think are best for you. When you vote, you're going to be allowed to pick two because there are two slots that are open. You will see on the ballot that there are two incumbent justices who are up for re-election. So you'll see that designation on the ballot, but you are permitted to pick two, and the top two vote getters fill the two spots. So you have to prepare yourself to not only vote once, but to actually select two and figure out which of the two you want to select.
Well, it's just mere days away now. We'll count down the days to this election. So do your homework and get those votes in. And of course, the biggest advice we can give you out there is to make sure you get out and vote. Thank you, Tom. Appreciate the time.
Thank you, Todd, for having me.